My former son-in-law tried to claim my late husband's war medals and declare me mentally unfit, fabricating stories about my memory. He tried to control my life and home, even bringing guardianship papers. I secretly recorded his schemes, played along with his deceit, and exposed his actions with undeniable evidence in court, reclaiming my independence and Arthur's honor. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe for more stories, and if you have any helpful life advice, feel free to share in the comments below. The air in my living room that crisp autumn evening was thick with the scent of pine and cinnamon, a bittersweet aroma that always conjured memories of Arthur. It was our annual memorial gathering for him, a tradition we'd started after he passed, a way to keep his spirit alive among those who loved him most. Friends, family, and fellow veterans from Arthur's regiment filled the space, their hushed conversations punctuated by the gentle clink of glasses. I moved among them, a silent sentinel, offering comfort and absorbing the collective warmth, a familiar ache in my chest that was both grief and love. Then, Thomas appeared. My former son-in-law, a man I'd once welcomed into my family with an open heart, stood before me, his smile a little too wide, his eyes a little too eager. He was divorced from my daughter, Clara, years ago, but he'd maintained a superficial connection, always dropping in, always with an ulterior motive I now suspected. "Eleanor," he began, his voice a low rumble that grated on my nerves. "I wanted to talk to you about Arthur's medals." My heart, already fragile with memories, hitched. Those medals were more than just metal and ribbon. They were sacred, tangible representations of Arthur's bravery, his sacrifice, his very essence. They lay nestled in the mahogany display case in the corner, a place of honor, constantly catching the light. "What about them, Thomas?" I asked, my voice a whisper I hoped disguised the tremor that ran through me. He cleared his throat, glancing around as if seeking an audience for his pronouncement. His current girlfriend, Tiffany, a woman half his age with an unsettlingly blank expression, stood a few feet behind him, observing. "Well, you know how Arthur always considered me like a son," he said, feigned earnestness dripping from his tone. "He always talked about how he wanted me to have them, for safekeeping, you know, to honor his legacy." A cold dread settled in my stomach, chilling me from the inside out. Arthur had never, not once, mentioned anything of the sort. His will, a document we'd reviewed countless times together, stated explicitly that the medals were to be donated to the local military museum. It was a wish we'd discussed at length, his desire for them to inspire future generations, not gather dust in a private collection. "Thomas, that's not what Arthur wanted," I replied, my voice firm despite the rising unease. "His intention was for them to go to the museum for everyone to appreciate, for the young cadets to see them and understand the meaning of duty." He chuckled, a dismissive sound that grated on my nerves like nails on a chalkboard. "Oh, Eleanor, you know how you can be," he said, waving a hand vaguely as if brushing away a pesky fly. "Sometimes you get a little confused. Arthur and I had many conversations about this. He specifically said they should stay in the family, and who better than me as a fellow man who understands honor to safeguard them?" His gaze flickered towards Clara, my daughter, who was standing nearby, her expression unreadable. He was planting seeds of doubt, not just with me, but with others. He was trying to erode my credibility, to make his absurd claim seem plausible by painting me as a senile widow. A few heads turned our way, drawn by the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere. I saw Margaret, my best friend from high school, her usually warm eyes narrowed with suspicion. Thomas, seemingly emboldened by the small audience, continued, his voice gaining a theatrical edge. "In fact, I remember Arthur saying it at your anniversary party just last year. He said, 'Thomas, these medals represent something special and I trust you to safeguard them.' Didn't he, Eleanor?" He looked at me, a challenge in his eyes, daring me to contradict him, to expose myself as the confused woman he was trying to portray. The memory of that anniversary party was still vivid in my mind. Arthur, frail but smiling, surrounded by loved ones, a beacon of joy in his final months. He had indeed spoken of his medals, yes, but only in the context of their historical significance and his desire for them to be displayed for educational purposes to inspire young people to serve their country. Thomas was twisting the truth, building a narrative where he was the rightful heir, a narrative woven from lies and manipulation. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself to regain my composure. "Thomas, you are mistaken," I stated, my voice low but resolute, cutting through the murmurs that had begun to ripple through the room. Arthur's wishes were very clear. The medals are to go to the museum. He wanted them to be a testament to the sacrifices made for our country, not a private trophy. He sighed dramatically, a theatrical gesture that screamed feigned patience. Eleanor dear, I understand you're going through a lot right now. With Arthur gone and well, age catches up to all of us. His gaze flickered towards Clara again, a subtle plea for her to confirm his fabricated narrative. He was planting seeds of doubt, not just with me but with others. He was trying to erode my credibility, to make his absurd claim seem plausible by painting me as a senile widow. The conversation ended there, a strained silence settling between us. Thomas, sensing he wouldn't get a public concession, offered a thin smile and retreated, melting back into the crowd, his eyes still occasionally darting my way, assessing the damage or perhaps congratulating himself on his performance. I spent the rest of the evening feeling a prickle of unease, watching Thomas interact with other family members, his conversations often punctuated by sidelong glances at me. He seemed to be subtly influencing them, weaving his fabricated story into their minds, sowing whispers about my supposed forgetfulness. It wasn't just about the medals anymore. It was about my reputation, my sanity, and the sacred legacy of the man I loved. That night, sleep offered no solace. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Thomas's smirking face, heard his condescending tone. I knew then that this wasn't just a misunderstanding, a clumsy attempt to console a grieving widow. This was a calculated, cold-hearted attempt to exploit my vulnerability, to steal from Arthur's memory. He saw me not as a grieving widow but as an easy target. And I would not let him win. I wouldn't let him dishonor Arthur's memory by claiming what wasn't his, especially under the guise of my alleged mental decline. This was war, and I was going to fight for Arthur's honor and my own. The days following the memorial gathering became a subtle, insidious campaign against me, orchestrated by Thomas. It started with small, unsettling incidents. My mail, usually neatly stacked on the hall table, would occasionally go missing, only to reappear days later in a different spot. Sometimes opened, sometimes with a casual "found this for you, Eleanor" from Clara, her eyes betraying a hint of worry. My reading glasses, which I always left by my favorite armchair, would mysteriously end up in the kitchen pantry or even, bafflingly, in the linen closet. Once, I found my car keys in the refrigerator, nestled among the eggs. At first, I attributed it to my own absent-mindedness, a natural consequence of grief and the inevitable march of time. I'd scold myself, "Eleanor, you really need to be more careful. You're losing your touch." But the incidents grew in frequency and peculiarity, always just enough to make me question myself without being overtly malicious, always just enough to sow the seeds of self-doubt. Then came the phone calls, the whispers spreading like wildfire through the family grapevine. My old friend Martha called one afternoon, her voice laced with concern. "Eleanor, are you feeling all right? Clara told me you've been a bit forgetful lately." My heart sank. Clara, my daughter, usually so protective, was being used as a pawn in Thomas's cruel game. "Forgetful? What do you mean, Martha?" I asked, my voice thin, a tremor I couldn't mask. "She said you misplaced your purse at the grocery store and then couldn't remember how you got home," Martha replied, her voice soft with pity. It was a complete fabrication. I hadn't misplaced my purse, and I had driven home without incident, navigating the familiar streets with practiced ease. It was then that I realized Thomas wasn't just manipulating me. He was actively influencing my daughter and other family members, creating a narrative of my supposed cognitive decline, making it easier for him to justify his actions later, to present himself as the responsible party. I started keeping a small, leather-bound journal, a cherished gift from Arthur years ago. In it, I meticulously recorded every odd incident, every suspicious phone call, every subtle insinuation of my declining mental state. October 12th, mail missing, found behind sofa. Martha called, Clara likely influenced by Thomas, spreading rumors of memory loss. Fabricated story about purse at grocery store. It became my lifeline, a way to anchor myself to reality when Thomas's relentless gaslighting threatened to make me doubt my own mind. I began testing myself, just like I used to do with Arthur's old crossword puzzles. I'd recite poetry I knew by heart, mentally list all the kings and queens of England in reverse order, recall complex recipes ingredient by ingredient, mentally map out the quickest route to any place in town. I wasn't slipping, I knew I wasn't, but Thomas was making sure everyone else believed I was. One afternoon, Clara came over, her brow furrowed with genuine worry. She held a cup of chamomile tea, her hands trembling slightly. "Mom, Thomas is really concerned about you," she began, sitting across from me at the kitchen table, her eyes searching mine for answers. "He thinks maybe you should consider getting some help around the house, perhaps a caregiver. Just for a few hours a day to keep an eye on things to make sure you're safe." My stomach tightened, a knot of dread forming in my gut. This was it, the next calculated step in his plan, moving from subtle insinuation to overt control. "I'm perfectly capable of managing my home, Clara," I said, trying to keep my voice even, to project an air of calm confidence I didn't entirely feel. "I appreciate your concern, but I don't need a caregiver. I've been managing just fine since your father passed." Clara sighed, running a hand through her hair, a gesture of exasperation mixed with genuine worry. "Mom, he says you've been leaving the stove on and forgetting to lock the doors. He even mentioned you sometimes call him Arthur, like you're confusing him with Dad." The accusations stung, each one a fabricated lie designed to portray me as frail, incompetent, and dangerously forgetful. I rarely left the stove on, and I was meticulous about locking doors, a habit instilled by Arthur. And I had never, not once, called Thomas Arthur. It was a cruel twist of the knife, playing on my grief and painting me as confused, a ghost of my former self. "Clara, this is Thomas putting ideas in your head," I said, my voice gaining strength, conviction hardening my tone. "He wants to discredit me so he can get his hands on Arthur's medals and perhaps more." Clara's expression remained troubled, a mixture of doubt and unwavering belief in Thomas, the man she'd once loved. "Mom, why would Thomas do something like that? He cares about you, he's just worried." Her unwavering belief in him, despite the growing evidence, was heartbreaking. It showed how deeply Thomas's manipulation had taken root, how thoroughly he had poisoned her perception of me. I knew then that I couldn't rely on my family's understanding alone. I had to build an undeniable, irrefutable case against him. The campaign escalated. Thomas started dropping by unannounced, often when I was alone, catching me off guard. He'd offer to help with chores, but his help usually involved moving things around, subtly disorganizing my belongings. He'd then point out the disarray, shaking his head sadly, a performance of profound concern. "Eleanor, you left this cupboard open again. Are you sure you're getting enough rest? You seem a bit disoriented." Each remark was a carefully placed brick in the wall of doubt he was building around me, brick by insidious brick, until he thought I would be completely trapped. I kept writing in my journal, documenting every detail, every insidious comment, every manipulated incident. My resolve hardened. I wasn't going to let him steal Arthur's legacy or my own peace of mind. He had declared war, and he had no idea the strength he was up against. This subtle erosion of my autonomy only fueled my determination. I would not become the helpless old woman he envisioned. I would prove him wrong, not just to myself, but to everyone he had deceived, even to my own daughter. The more Thomas pushed, the more I became convinced that his agenda extended beyond Arthur's medals. His insistent concerns about my memory, the constantly misplaced items, the whispered rumors about my supposed cognitive decline, it all felt like carefully laid groundwork for something larger, something far more sinister than just a few trinkets. I started observing him more closely when he visited. He would discreetly glance around the house, his eyes lingering on certain objects, particularly those of perceived value. He seemed to be cataloging, assessing like a vulture circling its prey, measuring its worth. One afternoon, he found my old jewelry box, slightly ajar, in a place I never kept it, tucked behind a stack of old magazines in the sunroom. "Eleanor, you left this open again," he said, his voice dripping with faux concern, his fingers brushing against the velvet lining. "We wouldn't want anything to go missing, would we?" His hand lingered on the box, almost possessively, as if he were already claiming its contents. It was clear he wasn't just after the medals, he wanted more. He wanted everything. I knew I needed irrefutable proof, something beyond my word against his. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I bought a small, discreet security camera online, the kind that looks exactly like an ordinary air freshener, blending seamlessly into any room. It arrived quickly, and I carefully installed it in the living room, strategically angled to capture the main entrance, the display case containing Arthur's medals, and the sofa where Thomas often sat. A tiny red light blinked almost imperceptibly, a silent sentinel in the corner of the room. My heart pounded as I set it up, a mixture of fear and grim determination. It felt like an invasion of my own privacy, a step I never imagined I'd have to take, but I knew it was necessary to protect myself, Arthur's legacy, and my future. My journal entry that day read, October 20th. Surveillance installed, no more guessing, this is real, the trap is set. A few days later, Thomas visited, bringing Clara with him, ostensibly for a check-in. While Clara was distracted in the kitchen making tea, humming a nervous tune, Thomas moved to the display case where Arthur's medals lay. I watched through the camera feed on my tablet, hidden beneath a gardening magazine on the coffee table. He opened the glass door, his fingers hovering over the medals, his eyes gleaming with avarice. He didn't take them, not yet, but the intent was palpable, radiating from him like heat. He was testing the waters, gauging my reaction, or rather, my perceived lack of one. When I came back into the living room, feigning a need for a pillow for my aching back, he was casually admiring a landscape painting on the wall. "Eleanor, this painting is lovely. I never noticed the detail before." He was smooth, but I saw through his act. He was a predator, slowly circling his prey, his true intentions thinly veiled by false concern. The true extent of his plan became horrifyingly clear after a phone call from my doctor's office. A new voice, unfamiliar to me, called to confirm a cognitive assessment appointment for next week. "I didn't make an appointment," I stated, my hand shaking as I held the phone, a cold dread washing over me. The woman on the other end read back my full name, address, and date of birth, every detail chillingly accurate. "It was scheduled by your son-in-law, Thomas," she stated, her voice devoid of emotion. My blood ran cold, a glacial wave of fear. He wasn't just trying to imply I was forgetful. He was trying to legally declare me incompetent, to have a court rule me unfit to manage my own affairs. This was beyond the medals. This was about controlling my entire life, my assets, my independence, everything. I immediately called my doctor, Dr. Evans, a kind, understanding man who had been my physician for decades, a trusted confidant. He was shocked, his voice laced with indignation. "Eleanor, I've seen you recently, and you are perfectly lucid. Thomas called me a few weeks ago with some vague concerns about your memory, but I dismissed them as typical family worries. I certainly didn't authorize any cognitive assessment, and I told him as much." He promised to look into it immediately, to block any further attempts by Thomas to schedule appointments on my behalf, and to flag his name in my file. The relief washed over me, a powerful wave, but it was quickly replaced by a fierce, unyielding determination. Thomas was playing a dangerous, high-stakes game, and he had just shown his hand. That night, alone in the quiet of my home, I reviewed the camera footage. There, clear as day, was Thomas on his phone, pacing in front of the display case. His voice, low and conspiratorial, filtered through the recording. "She's losing it, I tell you, just a matter of time before she's declared unfit. Then those medals and everything else will be mine." He chuckled, a chilling sound that made my skin crawl, a sound of pure, unadulterated greed. "The lawyer says if I can get her declared incompetent, it makes everything so much easier to transfer ownership to get the house to access her funds." The proof I needed, undeniable and damning, lay before me. It wasn't just my imagination, it was a calculated, cold-hearted plot. I backed up the recording twice, once to my secure cloud storage and once to a flash drive I hid behind a loose brick in the fireplace, a secret vault for my growing arsenal. A grim smile touched my lips. The game had shifted. I wasn't just defending myself, I was setting a trap, and Thomas, blinded by his avarice, was about to walk right into it. With the irrefutable evidence in hand, I knew I had to shift my strategy. Playing along with Thomas's narrative was no longer just about gathering proof. It was about lulling him into a false sense of security, making him believe he had already won. I started leaning into the dementia act, embracing the role with a chilling precision. When Thomas came over, I would deliberately misplace my keys, only to find them moments later in an obvious spot, like on the coffee table right in front of him. I'd ask him the same question twice in a single conversation, then feign embarrassment, a hand fluttering to my chest. "Oh, did I ask you that already, dear? My goodness, my memory isn't what it used to be. It just slips right out of my head." His eyes would gleam with satisfaction, a predatory glint that spoke of his perceived victory. He thought he was winning, thought he was orchestrating my slow descent into incompetence. I started calling Clara multiple times a day, sometimes for trivial things, acting like I had completely forgotten our previous conversation. Clara dear, did you remember to pick up the dry cleaning? Oh, you already did. My goodness, I must be losing my mind, I completely forgot we talked about that. Each call, each slip, was a meticulously planned performance, designed to reinforce the narrative Thomas was so diligently constructing. It pained me to mislead my daughter, to see the worry in her eyes as she heard my fabricated confusion, but I knew it was for her own good in the long run. If she saw through my act now, if she realized I was deliberately misleading Thomas, he might become suspicious and alter his plan, making it harder for me to expose him. I needed him to be overconfident, utterly convinced he had me completely fooled, completely under his manipulative thumb. The more I played the role, the more careless Thomas became. He started speaking freely in front of me, assuming I wasn't truly listening or comprehending, believing my mind was too clouded to grasp his nefarious plans. One afternoon, while I was napping on the sofa, with the hidden camera recording, of course, capturing every whispered word, he was on the phone in the living room, unaware of the tiny, watchful eye observing him. The museum director is a stickler for details, he grumbled into the phone, his voice low and conspiratorial. But I told him Aliner's getting worse, really slipping, and she'd want them with a responsible family member, someone who understands their true value. Told him she's been confusing her dates and names, forgetting conversations. He's starting to waver, I tell you, he's almost convinced. My heart hammered against my ribs, a furious drumbeat of indignation, but I kept my breathing even, feigning the deep, rhythmic breaths of sleep. He was actively undermining Arthur's final wishes with the museum, trampling on his legacy. This was a direct attack on everything Arthur stood for. He even started bringing potential buyers for the house over, under the flimsy guise of friends dropping by for coffee. He'd lead them through the rooms, pointing out architectural features, whispering about potential renovations once Aliner moves to assisted living. Once, he even brought a real estate agent, a slick, impeccably dressed woman who surveyed my beloved home with calculating eyes. I was in the kitchen, pretending to struggle with opening a stubborn jar of pickles, making exaggerated grunts of effort. I could hear him clearly in the living room, his voice oozing with false charm. The old girl's got no concept of market value anymore, he boasted, his voice a low sneer. She'll sign anything I put in front of her, we'll flip this place for a fortune, easy profit. His words were a venomous confirmation of his true intentions, a sickening glimpse into his predatory mind. He wasn't just after the medals. He wanted the house, my home, the place where Arthur and I built our lives, where we raised our children, where every corner held a cherished memory. I continued to document everything in my journal, my hand steady as I wrote. November 5th, played confused with Thomas, he seemed pleased. Overheard him on phone discussing museum director, fabricating stories about my memory. November 8th, Thomas brought real estate agent. Overheard him planning to flip the house, openly discussing his greed. The pretense was exhausting, mentally and emotionally draining, but the thought of Arthur's medals, his legacy, being stolen by this deceitful man, and my home, our sanctuary, being sold out from under me kept me going. I knew I couldn't break character, not yet. Thomas was so absorbed in his perceived victory that he missed the subtle shifts in my demeanor, the calculating glint in my eye when he wasn't looking. He saw only what he wanted to see. A vulnerable old woman, ripe for the picking, a pawn in his grand scheme. His arrogance was my greatest weapon, a blind spot he couldn't see. He was walking directly into the trap I was meticulously setting, every fabricated slip, every feigned moment of confusion, a thread in the net I was weaving around him. He thought he was the puppet master, pulling my strings, but he was merely dancing to my tune, oblivious to his impending downfall. As Thomas's confidence grew, so did his recklessness, turning his subtle manipulations into bolder, more overt actions. He began to openly discuss his plans with Clara, my daughter, believing that I was too far gone to understand, too lost in the fog of dementia to comprehend his nefarious intentions. My heart ached to see Clara caught in his web, her genuine concern for me twisted by Thomas's insidious lies, her loyalty exploited. One afternoon, he came over while I was napping in my armchair, the hidden camera discreetly recording from its perch. He thought I was deeply asleep, but every word of his conversation with Clara in the kitchen, where they thought they were safe from my ears, was crystal clear. The lawyer is almost ready with the papers for Aliner's guardianship, Thomas whispered, his voice tinged with eager anticipation. "Once that's signed, we can officially sell the house and divide the assets. And those medals, they'll finally be in my possession, safe and sound, a personal tribute to Arthur." Clara's voice was hesitant, laced with a familiar note of doubt. "But Thomas, Mom really wants them to go to the museum. Are you sure this is what Arthur would have wanted? And what about the house? She loves this house." Thomas scoffed, a dismissive sound that betrayed his utter contempt for my feelings or Arthur's wishes. "Eleanor's confused, Clara. She doesn't know what she wants. Arthur wanted them to stay with family. And besides, think of the money we could get from the house. A nice nest egg for you too, a little something extra for your retirement." The implication was chillingly clear. Clara would directly benefit from my forced incapacitation, from the theft of my autonomy and my assets. I knew, in that moment, that I couldn't expose Thomas alone. I needed an ally, someone who remembered the sharp, formidable woman I once was, before Thomas decided I was disposable, before he began his insidious campaign to erase me. And I knew exactly who that person was. Sergeant Miller, Arthur's commanding officer during the war, a stoic, no-nonsense veteran who now managed the local VFW hall. He and Arthur had been lifelong friends, sharing a bond forged in the crucible of battle, a loyalty that transcended time. I hadn't seen Sergeant Miller since Arthur's funeral, a somber day etched deeply in my memory, but I knew he would never tolerate such disrespect to a fallen comrade, such a brazen attack on Arthur's legacy. The next morning, determined and resolute, I drove to the VFW hall. The scent of stale coffee and worn wood filled the air, a familiar comfort that wrapped around me like an old blanket. There he was, Sergeant Miller, his broad shoulders still imposing despite his age, his hands methodically polishing a display case filled with military memorabilia. When he saw me, his eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise in their depths. "Eleanor, good heavens, you look, well, I haven't seen you in ages." He extended a hand, his grip surprisingly strong, a testament to his enduring strength. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I told him everything about Thomas's audacious claims regarding Arthur's medals, his insidious campaign to paint me as mentally incompetent, the hidden camera footage, the lawyer's call about guardianship, and his plans to sell my cherished home. Sergeant Miller listened, his expression growing darker with each revelation. He didn't interrupt, didn't scoff, didn't patronize. He simply nodded, his jaw set, his gaze fixed on some distant point, as if recalling his own battles. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment, the only sound the quiet hum of the hall. Then he spoke, his voice low and gravelly, a voice accustomed to giving commands. I figured something was off when that snake Thomas came sniffing around. My head snapped up, surprise lacing my voice. "He came to you?" I asked, incredulous. "Aye," Miller confirmed, a grimace tightening his lips. "About a month ago. Asked about Arthur's will, specifically about the medals. Said Arthur had promised them to him personally, wanted my testimony to back it up. Said you were too distraught to remember clearly, that your grief was making you confused." A cold rage, unlike anything I had felt before, washed over me, a searing heat that burned away any lingering fear. He had been planning this for months, meticulously building his false narrative, exploiting my vulnerability, trying to turn my friends and family against me. "What did you tell him?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, afraid to break the fragile tension. Miller's eyes gleamed with a steely resolve, a veteran's defiance. "I told him Arthur's will was clear as day, the medals go to the museum, and I told him if he tried anything underhanded, he'd have me to deal with. He didn't like that very much, no sir." Miller then pulled out a small, dog-eared notebook from his pocket, its pages worn with age. "I wrote down everything he said just in case." Thomas was cocky. Thought I was just a senile old veteran, easy to manipulate. He even mentioned the name of his lawyer, some hotshot estate planner, a young woman named Brenda Jenkins. He handed me the notebook. On a crumpled page, neatly scrawled, was the name and a phone number. I stared at the name, a crucial piece of the puzzle finally clicking into place. Thomas wasn't just gaslighting me. He was actively enlisting legal counsel, laying the groundwork for a hostile takeover of my life. My stomach churned, but this time it wasn't fear, it was focused determination, a cold resolve. Now I had a name, a person to trace, a breadcrumb trail leading directly to the heart of his deception. I thanked Sergeant Miller, feeling a surge of profound gratitude for his unwavering loyalty to Arthur's memory, for being a beacon of truth in the darkness Thomas had created. "You're a true friend, Miller," I said, my voice thick with emotion, tears blurring my vision. "Arthur would be proud." He simply nodded, his gaze firm, his eyes conveying a silent promise of support. "We protect our own, Eleanor. Always." As I left the VFW hall, I felt a renewed sense of purpose, a quiet strength settling within me. Thomas had no idea who he was truly up against. He had awakened the spirit of a woman who had faced life's toughest battles and emerged victorious. And this battle against him would be no different. With Brenda Jenkins's name and number in hand, I formulated the next crucial step of my plan. I knew I couldn't call her as myself. That would immediately tip off Thomas, sending him scrambling to cover his tracks. Instead, I called the number, adopting a slightly younger, more professional voice, a carefully crafted persona. "Hello, this is Miss Eleanor Whittaker's assistant," I began, my voice steady and confident. "I'm calling to confirm her appointment regarding estate planning." The woman on the other end, Brenda Jenkins herself, sounded brisk and efficient, her voice devoid of any warmth. "Yes, we have Miss Eleanor Whittaker scheduled for next Tuesday at 10 a.m., she stated, her words like a punch to the gut. "We'll be reviewing the guardianship transfer documents and the deed change for the property." My breath caught in my throat, a gasp I barely managed to suppress. Guardianship transfer and deed change. It was worse than I thought, far more insidious than I had imagined. Thomas wasn't just after the medals and some cash. He wanted complete legal control of my entire life, my assets, my home, my very independence. He intended to strip me of my autonomy, to render me a non-person in the eyes of the law. I managed to keep my voice steady, remarkably so, considering the seismic shift in my world. "Perfect. Thank you for confirming." I hung up, my hand still gripping the phone, the receiver feeling cold and heavy in my palm. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, a dizzying spiral into a nightmare I was determined to escape. He wasn't just trying to imply I was incompetent, he was already putting the legal framework in place to take everything. This wasn't a game, it was a ruthless, calculated power play, and he intended to win at any cost. I immediately added this new, damning information to my journal. November 14th, called Brenda Jenkins. Confirmed guardianship and deed transfer documents are prepared. Thomas's full, malicious intentions revealed. He wants everything. The next few days were a blur of meticulous preparation, each action a calculated move in my silent war. I continued my act of mental decline, making my slips more frequent and more pronounced, painting a picture of a woman rapidly losing her grip on reality. I'd ask Thomas about the same topic 3 or 4 times in a single conversation, then feign exhaustion, my voice a weary sigh. "Oh, my head is just not clear today, dear. Did I already ask you about the mail? It's all a bit hazy." He would patiently and smugly repeat himself, often exchanging knowing glances with Clara, who, sadly, still seemed to believe his narrative, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and concern. Each moment was a performance, designed to convince him that I was indeed losing my grip on reality, that his efforts were bearing fruit. I also made sure to mention my confusion to other family members and close friends, subtly reinforcing the image Thomas was trying to create. "Oh, I keep forgetting my appointments lately," I'd sigh dramatically to Margaret over the phone. "It's all these new medications, they really scramble my thoughts." It was a delicate balance, a tightrope walk between appearing genuinely forgetful and raising too much suspicion. But it was crucial for the next phase of my plan. I needed Thomas to be utterly convinced of his success, to feel completely secure in his deception, to believe he held all the cards. His overconfidence would be his ultimate downfall. The day before my appointment with Brenda Jenkins, a day I marked with a grim certainty in my journal, Clara arrived unannounced, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen from unshed tears. She clutched a thick manila envelope to her chest like a shield. "Mom," she began, her voice trembling, barely above a whisper, "we just want what's best for you. Thomas says this is for your own good." My heart pounded, a frantic drumbeat in my chest. This was it. I had anticipated this moment, rehearsed my reaction countless times in my mind. I stepped aside and let her in, watching her sit at the kitchen table, her shoulders slumped, the same table where I had helped her with homework, where she had shared her childhood dreams, and where she had proudly told me she was pregnant with my first grandchild. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and sorrow, as if I were already gone, a ghost inhabiting my own skin. She slid the envelope across the table, its contents a stark symbol of her brother-in-law's treachery. "It's temporary guardianship, Mom," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Just until we figure things out. Thomas said it's for your protection, that you're not safe living alone anymore." For a split second, looking at her strained face, feeling the weight of her genuine concern, I almost believed it. I almost let the fog of doubt creep back in, almost succumbed to the despair and the insidious narrative they had constructed around me. But then I felt the small voice recorder in my pocket, the cold, hard reality of the device containing the carefully collected evidence, the irrefutable proof of Thomas's betrayal. The file I had been saving, meticulously building for this exact moment. I pulled out my phone, pressed play, and sat it on the table like a weapon, aimed directly at the heart of their deception. Clara's face changed the second Thomas's voice came out of the tiny speaker, clear as day, chillingly devoid of emotion. "Just get her to sign, Clara. She trusts you more than me. Don't ask questions, just get her signature. Don't worry about what it says, she won't remember 5 minutes later." Then came the sound of his laughter, a cruel, mocking sound that hit me like a physical blow, stripping away any last vestiges of doubt about his intentions. Clara's hands were already shaking violently, spilling a little tea from her cup as she whispered, "What is this?" Her eyes darted from the phone to the envelope, then back to me, disbelief warring with horror. "It's your former husband, Thomas, Clara, making you his unwitting puppet," I replied, my voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil raging inside me. "He's using your concern against you, just like he's trying to use my perceived dementia against me." She tried to speak, but no words came out, only a choked gasp of guilt and disbelief, a sound of utter devastation. She reached for the envelope again, her fingers trembling as if to tear it apart, but I put my hand over it, stopping her. "No, leave it here, it's evidence." She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face, a torrent of raw emotion. "I didn't know, Mom. I swear to God, I thought maybe. He told me you'd wandered into the street last week, that you forgot your name, that you were leaving the gas on." I nodded slowly, my gaze unwavering. "Of course he did, Clara, because it's easier than admitting he wants my house, my money, and Arthur's medals for himself. Easier than admitting he's a thief and a liar." She said nothing, just shook her head, tears falling onto the table, wetting the manila envelope. "What do we do?" she whispered, her voice broken. "You stop listening to him, Clara," I said, my voice firm, "and you start remembering who raised you. You start remembering Arthur and what he believed in. And you help me make sure he never does this to anyone else again." That night, after Clara left, leaving the guardianship papers behind, I opened my journal. November 20th. Clara delivered legal docs manipulated by Thomas. Evidence played, doubt planted, loyalty shifting. Not alone anymore. The trap is set and he is walking right into it. The day I disappeared wasn't dramatic. There was no hurried escape in the middle of the night, no suitcase dragging down the driveway, no dramatic last glance at the house. I simply left, quietly, early in the morning, before the sun touched the porch swing that Arthur had built for me. I packed a small duffel bag, 3 days' worth of clothes, my precious leather-bound journal, both flash drives with the damning recordings, and the iPad that held the raw footage. I drove 2 hours north to Sergeant Miller's cabin, navigating the winding back roads using a borrowed map route I hadn't used in 20 years, deliberately avoiding main roads and any form of traceable technology. No GPS, no credit cards, no texts, no digital footprint. I needed them to worry, especially Thomas. He had built his little empire on the assumption that I would remain still, a passive target, absorbing every blow he dealt. But my carefully planned departure triggered something else entirely, something he wasn't prepared for. At 7 o'clock m sharp, precisely as scheduled, my pre-written email dropped into every inbox I had ever trusted, every person who might bear witness to his lies. My church group, my HOA president, my pharmacist, my former coworkers from the library, even 3 of Thomas's biggest clients whose contact information I had subtly gleaned from Clara's phone before she realized what I was doing. All of them received a meticulously compiled file titled, "In Case I'm Not Safe." Inside was a neatly organized folder containing audio files of Thomas's conspiratorial phone calls, screenshots of forged appointment calendars he had tried to create in my name, transcripts of manipulated prescription requests he had attempted to authorize, video stills from the hidden living room camera showing him tampering with Arthur's display case, voicemail recordings of him planning the guardianship switch with his lawyer, Brenda Jenkins, and the absolute crowning jewel. A clean, full voicemail where he laughed, his voice chillingly clear, and said, "She won't even remember signing it. I'll flip the house before she figures it out, and those old medals will be mine." Within hours, my phone, which I had deliberately left at home, began to explode with messages. Voicemails stacked up, texts flooded the inbox, emails piled high, and even 2 frantic Facebook posts from friends asking if I was okay, if the rumors were true. But the real victory, the true ripple effect of my calculated move, came at 3:17 p.m. when Sergeant Miller got a phone call from Clara. Her voice was shaky, a tremor he could discern even over the phone, as she told him she had been getting messages all day from people forwarding the email, asking if it was true, if Thomas really did all those things, if her mother, Alina, was truly in danger. Miller said Clara didn't even ask where I was, her only concern was if I was safe. Then came the unexpected twist, a deliciously ironic karmic retribution that I hadn't even factored into my grand design. Thomas's new girlfriend, Tiffany, the young woman with whom he was planning a future, with whom he'd been seen parading around town, suddenly vanished from his life. She deleted every single photo of them off her social media, even the ones from the family gathering where he had first made his audacious claim about Arthur's medals. She completely wiped him from her online existence, leaving no digital trace of their relationship. Then, just as suddenly, she returned online, posting a new picture of her impossibly fluffy poodle with a caption that simply read, "Peace is worth starting over." It meant she saw the files, she saw what he'd said, what he'd planned, what kind of man she was about to commit to. Just like that, his carefully constructed personal life, his carefully curated image, cracked open from the inside, collapsing under the weight of his own lies. I stayed gone for 3 full days, holed up in Miller's spare cabin, a rustic haven tucked away deep in the woods. There was no heat and the power was spotty, but I wrote everything down by candlelight, huddled under thick blankets, reading through the flood of reactions forwarded to me through Miller's email. Messages poured in, a torrent of support and apologies. "I'm so sorry I doubted you, Alina," or "I never liked how he looked at you, I always sensed something off." One simply read, "Do you need a place to stay, Alina? My door is always open." I didn't respond to any of them, not because I wasn't grateful, but because this wasn't the end. This was merely the earthquake before the landslide. When I returned, I wouldn't be coming back as a victim or a ghost or some fragile story people whispered about. I'd be walking back into my house as the woman who took every weapon used against her and turned them into a blueprint for revenge, a testament to resilience. And when I did, I'd bring all the truth with me, printed, stapled, and ready for court. This was only the beginning of Thomas's downfall. I walked into that courthouse on a Tuesday morning like I was walking into church the day after the world ended. Calm, clean, dressed in my Sunday best, and not afraid of a single soul in that building. I wore Arthur's navy blue blazer, the one I'd kept in the back of the closet for funerals and for real battles, its familiar weight on my shoulders a comforting presence. As I stepped through security with a manila folder thicker than a Bible, crammed full of documents and evidence, I didn't even flinch when I saw Thomas sitting in the hallway. He was pretending to scroll his phone, pretending like he didn't see me, his face pale and drawn. For the first time since this entire war started, I felt no fear, no burning anger, just a quiet, unwavering focus. Because now it wasn't about emotion, it was about evidence. And I had it all, stacked, time-stamped, signed, and cross-referenced, meticulously organized for presentation. When they called my name, I stood up straight, adjusted the lapels of Arthur's blazer, and walked into that courtroom, my stride even, my head held high. I greeted the judge with a respectful nod, like a woman who still remembered how to be respected, how to command a room. Thomas sat across from me with his lawyer, a nervous young man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Thomas whispered fast, sweating through his collar, his eyes darting frantically around the room, avoiding my gaze. The judge, a stern but fair-looking woman with kind eyes, asked if I had representation. "No, Your Honor," I said, my voice clear and steady, resonating through the silent courtroom. "Just the truth." I approached the bench and handed over the thick folder, sliding it across the polished wood, the weight of the evidence palpable. And then I waited. What followed was 23 minutes of quiet reading, the rustle of papers, and the chilling playback of audio files. The judge listened intently, her expression unchanging, as Thomas's own voice echoed from my recordings, clear and damning, saying things like, She's losing it, I tell you. Just a matter of time before she's declared unfit. Then those medals and everything else will be mine. And, the lawyer says if I can get her declared incompetent, it makes everything so much easier to transfer ownership to get the house to access her funds. She won't remember 5 minutes later. The judge then reviewed the comprehensive medical records I'd included, showing no cognitive decline on my part, the meticulously cross-referenced pharmacy logs confirming my medication was regular and unaltered, the emails with forged dates for appointments I never made, and the voice messages where he laughed about flipping the house, about defrauding me. The judge didn't blink once until she got to the part where I'd been recorded in my own home without consent. She looked up, her gaze piercing through Thomas's lawyer. "Who installed the cameras?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. Thomas's lawyer, flustered, tried to object, stammering about privacy violations, but the judge waved him off, her hand slicing through the air like a blade. "You can speak after I'm done reviewing this," she stated, her authority absolute. I sat there in absolute silence, my gaze fixed on Thomas, who was now visibly trembling. Every second that passed was a victory. Every pause, every rustle of paper, every word spoken by the judge was a nail in the coffin of the elaborate lie they had built around me. Finally, the judge leaned back in her chair, her expression one of profound disappointment. "Mrs. Alina Whittaker," she began, her voice ringing with authority. "Based on this compelling and thoroughly documented evidence, I am hereby terminating all powers of attorney previously granted to the defendant Thomas, effective immediately. Furthermore, I am initiating an emergency investigation into attempted medical manipulation and financial abuse, and recommending the district attorney review this case for possible criminal charges against Mr. Thomas. Additionally, I am issuing a permanent restraining order against the defendant to prevent him from approaching Mrs. Whittaker or her property. And most importantly," she paused, her gaze settling on the display case in my living room, "I am formally ordering that Arthur's war medals be immediately transferred to the local military museum, as per his last will and testament. There will be no further debate on this matter." I didn't react, didn't smile, didn't even move a muscle. I wanted Thomas to know this wasn't joy. This was justice. This was the quiet, undeniable weight of truth. As we left the courtroom, Thomas, looking utterly defeated, tried to look at me, tried to say something, a pathetic whisper of a plea, but I walked right past him like he was a stranger on a bench, a forgotten ghost. And when I got outside, standing in the bright sunlight, I didn't even cry. I just stood there, letting the warmth hit my face, a tangible proof that I still existed, still had my name, my rights, and my mind. I pulled out my journal and wrote the only entry that day, my hand steady, my resolve unwavering. November 25th. Power returned. Truth confirmed. War not over, but I'm not losing. The fallout came fast, faster than even I expected, like watching a dam split open after weeks of quiet pressure, unleashing a torrent of consequences. It started with a phone call from Clara 2 days after the hearing, her voice shaky but filled with a newfound clarity. She told me Thomas had been let go from his company, not fired exactly, but mutually separated after someone, undoubtedly one of his former clients I'd emailed, anonymously forwarded a copy of the court documents to his board. The whispers, the insinuations, the fraud, it had all come crashing down. The next day, I received an official email from my bank confirming full reinstatement of access to all my accounts, with an added note that Thomas's authorization had been permanently revoked. I didn't respond. I just printed the email and taped it inside the front cover of my journal like a badge of honor. Within a week, the rest started crumbling. His former girlfriend, Tiffany, the young woman he'd paraded around, completely deleted her entire Instagram account, then resurfaced online without a single trace of him. No photos of them, no engagement rings, no wedding plans, nothing but a caption under a picture of her impossibly fluffy poodle that simply read, "Peace is worth starting over." It meant she saw the files, saw what he'd said, what he'd planned, what kind of man she was about to commit to. Just like that, his carefully constructed personal life, his carefully curated image of a successful, honorable man, cracked open from the inside, collapsing under the weight of his own lies. Clara told me she'd called her former husband just once since the hearing. She'd confronted him, her voice strong and clear. He denied everything, of course, saying I'd faked it, that I'd tricked the court, that I was crazy. I asked her what she said back. She paused, then told me, "I told him I saw the recordings, Thomas, and I believe her now. You were trying to use me just like you tried to use Alina." And he'd responded, spitting the words, "Then you're just as crazy as she is," and she'd hung up. I didn't say anything to that, I just listened. What could I say? He chose his war and he lost it. Now the silence was louder than anything he could have said. Then came the message I'd been expecting, not from Thomas but from my grandson. A short email sent late at night that simply said, "Grandma, I'm sorry." And below it was an attached photo he'd drawn of me and him baking, our figures rendered in childlike scrawls. I was holding a mixing spoon and smiling, and in the corner he'd scribbled, "You're not losing your mind." I stared at that for a long time, longer than I should have, because that's what hurt the most. Not the money, not the lies, not the public humiliation, but the way he'd let his own son turn against me, like it was a joke, like I was some meme instead of a person, a woman who loved him fiercely. I didn't reply, not because I was angry, but because I didn't know how to say, "I forgive you, but I won't forget," in a way a child could understand. Finally, 1 week after court, I received the last, predictable piece of the puzzle, an email from Thomas with the subject line, "Closure," and nothing in the body except a single, chilling sentence. "You really want to go down like this?" I didn't open it, didn't forward it, didn't reply. I just flagged it as spam and archived it forever because the truth was I didn't want closure. I wanted peace. And that meant keeping him out of my house, my inbox, and my life for good. I hosted a small gathering exactly 2 months after the night Thomas tried to erase me with his disrespectful claim and his insidious lies. But this time, it was my backyard, bathed in the soft glow of fairy lights, my guest list, my music playing low over the outdoor speakers Arthur and I had installed years ago. And I made Arthur's favorite apple pie myself. Same recipe, same worn glass dish, its edges slightly chipped. But this time, my hands didn't shake when I set it down on the picnic table, and only people who'd stood by me were there. Clara, her eyes clear and bright again, Sergeant Miller, his stern face softened by a rare smile, Martha from the church, my old coworker Susan, who'd emailed me after the files dropped to say, "I always knew he gave me a bad feeling, Eleanor. I'm so glad you exposed him." And even my grandson came, quiet at first but present, carrying a grocery bag of fresh blueberries and asking if he could help set the table, his small voice hesitant but genuine. I said yes without hesitation because I wasn't carrying resentment anymore. Just memory, just wisdom, just weight that didn't need to be passed on, a burden I was finally free of. We sat outside under the warm lights, the evening air cool and crisp, and laughed like nothing had been stolen because it hadn't, not really. I got it all back. My rights, my voice, my name, and Arthur's honor. And when it got quiet, when the sun dipped low and the sky turned that soft orange I always loved, bleeding into twilight, I stood up, raised my glass and said, my voice resonating with a quiet power, "If they ever try to take your voice, your name, or your mind, don't shout to be heard. Don't beg to be believed, just wait, watch, and make sure that when you strike back, it's so clean they never get back up." There wasn't applause, just stillness, the kind that sinks in. The kind that tells you every single person understood exactly what I meant. And I looked at Clara across the table, watched her wipe her eyes, watched my grandson pick at a napkin, then slowly nod to himself like he just learned something he wouldn't forget. And then I sat down, took a bite of pie, its sweet tartness a taste of victory, and tasted everything that had once been buried. The dignity, the power, the simple right to be seen and heard without being questioned. And I didn't think about Thomas, not even once. Because the best revenge isn't rage or prison or dragging someone through the mud. It's removing them from your life so completely that they vanish from every future version of yourself, leaving no trace, no impact. And I didn't need a court date or another confrontation because I already won. And I didn't just win. I survived. I walked back into my home, sat at the same table he tried to strip me from, and proved that not only am I still here, but I am sharper than ever, and no one will ever doubt that again. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the story, please make sure to subscribe and leave your thoughts in the comments.